How's it going, Elementalists? Today I wanted to start a series of videos talking about the starter decks in Elementile. For those of you who don't know, the starter decks are just 6 deck lists that can be found here on page 12 of the rulebook, and they cover a variety of element combinations and play styles, and they're a great starting point for new players who just want to come in, build a deck real quick, and get to playing Elementile. So I wanted to do a series of videos kind of covering the general strategies for each of them, strengths and weaknesses and strong positions, stuff like that. And that way somebody who's new to the game can watch any one of these videos and figure out which one of these decks they want to try and start out with. So without further ado, let's get into today's deck. Alright, so today I wanted to talk about the Radiant Pack. The Radiant Pack is a Firelight deck that is a great choice for beginners because it has a very straightforward game plan and strategy and win condition. Basically, it seeks to set up efficient fire units and march them down the field, supporting them with light units and spells to patch up some of their weaknesses so that they can just run down the field and take the fight to your opponent and win the game. So I've broken up the deck into 5 main categories here for each of the cards. We've got the unit core, support units, support spells, removal spells, and some special tech options for specific matchups. So I'm going to go through some example cards in each of these sections. So first up, I want to talk about the unit core. The unit core are your frontline units that you want to play first and advance down the board. These are the units that the support unit and spells are basically going to be supporting. A lot of these units are highly efficient fire units, and let's take a look at a couple examples. First of all, we have kind of the namesake of the deck in Effie, the Pyropack Heir. She is essentially an upgraded Pyrowolf Hunter, which is the card down here. And this is a card in the Pyrowolf series. We've got the Pyrowolf Pup, which is the little baby, and the Pyrowolf Alpha, which is the big guy. All of these cards are very emblematic of fire units in that they have very high health for their cost and very high attack edges, so they're able to stick on the board and hit very hard. They trade very efficiently with other cards of their cost. But they don't have any armor, which can make them specifically answered by other effects. And we'll talk about how we mitigate those when we get in the support units and support spells sections. Not only are these cards very efficient, but they're pretty flexible. All these Pyrowolf Hunters have activated abilities that allow you to spend extra elements, usually fire, to boost their attack even further, which gives your opponent even more that they have to respect. Next up, let's talk about the support units. So I mentioned before when we were talking about the unit core that fire units often don't have very much or any armor at all. This can make them very susceptible to effects like freezing and instant death that are really nasty if they actually deal hit point damage, which is very common if you don't have any armor to protect from those attacks. So part of the ways we mitigate this is through cards like the Master Medic and the Medic. Specifically that reaction ability down there that the first time an adjacent ally takes damage, we're going to prevent 2 of that damage. So if a freezing or instant death effect is going to hit one of our nice efficient fire units, and it would actually deal that nasty effect, but it doesn't do more than 2 damage, it's actually just going to be negated by this reaction, which helps keep them safe. The other ability, the first aid ability that just heals our units, can also be really useful with fire because they have very high hit point values, so they are more likely to survive hits and then need healing than some of the other elements. So a Master Medic and the Medic both have a similar suite of abilities that are very useful in this deck for basically patching up some of the biggest weaknesses of your unit core. Moving on to support spells. Support spells can do all manner of things, such as making one of your units basically completely immune to enemy spells, or increasing the attack and hit points of all of your units even further, or even just increasing an ally's attack. The card I really want to highlight in this section, though, is Sanctity. When you're pushing with this deck, sometimes you get yourself into trouble and overextend a bit. Sanctity all but ensures that at least one of your units will survive the next turn. Basically guarantees that. So if you happen to find yourself overextended and you don't want to lose everything, lose all the space you've gained over the course of the game, you may want to put Sanctity on one of your units to make sure it survives so that next turn you can provide it some reinforcement deeper than you would have been able to if you got your board wiped. So Sanctity can be really useful to ensure that all the pushing you have done thus far is not completely wasted on your opponent's next turn. Next up, we've got the removal spells. And at 8 cards, this category is actually the second most prominent in the deck. It makes up 20% of it, and that's for good reason. Blowing stuff up is one of Fire's greatest strengths. They have access to a lot of very efficient removal spells as well. And one of the most marquee would be the AoE removal spell, which is Explosion. Now, Explosion can cover a lot of different weaknesses of your units. Because they're not highly mobile and they don't have ranged attacks, Explosion can be used to pick off threats in the back that are going to have a high impact on the board without having to push forward and use their physical attacks. And it would take your units a long time to get over them to answer them themselves. So Explosion can be used in that case to remove a key threat or even hit an entire backline position of your opponents. Explosion can also be used to turn the tables if your opponent has basically gotten an advantage and pushed forward. You can use this to soften up their units or even clear the board. So you can go back to business as usual, resummoning your front line, pushing forward, and keeping the pressure up. And Explosion also deals with multiple threats very well. So most of your units can only hit one thing at a time. So if you're getting swarmed, Explosion is a good answer to that as well if they happen to keep their swarm in a tightly knit position like this. So all those things make Explosion a really key factor in this deck, and anybody who's played against it is going to know that it's in there and know that it has to be respected, because if you hit multiple units with this, it can just be absolutely devastating. So this is another one of those cards that between it and Lightning Cross, your opponents are going to have to be constantly worried about. And last but not least, we have some specific tech options. These options are usually to deal with freezing, which is one of Fire's worst matchups. And they're basically, we have 2 options here for if your units happen to get frozen. Your opponent was able to get past the mitigation effects of your support units and spells and actually freeze one of your units. These can be used to either remove the frozen with your Thawing Ring or the Mass Heal second effect, or they represent threats that are harder to freeze, like the Eternal Beacon, which cannot be frozen at all, or the Encroaching Flame, which is one of the few fire units that actually provides armor. It has an armor value on its own. So if you combine this with the effects of the support units like your Medic and Master Medic, it can be very difficult to freeze this particular unit. So these tech options are very useful when you're dealing with water decks that want to freeze you, or very specific lethal options from Darkness. But outside of that, they're not going to be as useful in other matchups and might end up being elements in that case. So now that we've covered some examples from each of the card categories in the deck, let's go over some specific combos. These combos don't go over just the cards that I've described so far, so I'll be going over each of the cards in the combos and what makes them so powerful when paired with each other. So first up, we have Frenzied Salamander plus Berserker's Rage. Frenzied Salamander is a very typical fire unit. It's got good health and good attack sides, but its gimmick is it has the Double Strike ability. This makes it really, really effective at shredding unarmored units, but not so great at attacking into armor. But it also makes it so that any effects that increase its attack, it gets double the value out of, which is why this is such a powerful combo. If you put Berserker's Rage on your Frenzied Salamander, all of a sudden you have a front attack that is hitting for 4 twice, and this thing can take on the world. 4 twice is almost enough to knock out a player in one hit. It's enough to hit and kill things that are much more expensive, and it makes this unit very, very scary. So that's why these 2 cards are very powerful together. Next up, we have the Sun Mage. Now, the Sun Mage is one of the only frontline units in this deck that isn't a fire unit, and if you look at its attacks, they don't seem that powerful. But when factoring in his Life Force ability and his base starting health of 6, when he's at full health, they're actually 3 higher than what's printed. So he's got a 5 front attack, 3 on the sides, and then 4 in the back there. And he is very powerful when paired with Mira, the People's Bond, another hero in this deck who supports a lot of units very well, but she's especially powerful with the Sun Mage. Just for being on the field, all of your units are going to have 2 more health, which gives the Sun Mage 1 more attack. And then even further, if she's adjacent to the Sun Mage, she can heal him for 3 every turn, keeping him topped off, making sure he's making the most of his attacks, and gives him another one attack even further. So she can make the Sun Mage incredibly threatening, whether she's adjacent to him or not. And the last combo is Pyrowolf Pup and Medic. So the Pyrowolf Pup is very similar to the Pyrowolf Hunter we discussed earlier, except it's much cheaper and its surge ability is a little more flexible. This thing on its own is a menace in the early game. It's got really good health and really good reach because of its surge ability. It can take on pretty much any other 1-drop and a lot of 2-drops even just on its own. But when combined with the Medic, these two are really a dynamic duo. If you put the Medic behind your Pyrowolf Pup, it prevents damage to it and tops it off if it manages to get hurt through that damage prevention. And the two basically ensure that you can have a pretty strong early game and really kind of push the issue and get yourself space to make sure you have a good start to your mid game. So in Elementile, when you get your starting hand, you actually pick a card from the deck first, and then you add 6 more cards to that to form your starting hand. I'm going to go over some recommendations for what that first pick should be and the rationales behind each of them, because there's a bunch of different ones that govern, and it kind of depends on whether you're going first or second. So first of all, we have the Pyrowolf Pup. As discussed in the card combo section, I mean, this guy is a menace all on his own in the early game. Very, very powerful 1-drop. This is probably the safe option if you're going first. You make sure you have a Pyrowolf Pup in your hand. You can play it turn 1, get the board presence moving, and making sure you have momentum to go into the mid game. If you're going second, then you're going to have 2 elements on your first turn, and if you want a unit, you can actually spring for something a little bigger, like the Frenzied Salamander. Frenzied Salamander is especially potent when dealing with lower armor decks, but if there's a high armor deck, you may not want to opt for this. But if you are going second against other options, this guy becomes more attractive because you're playing on curve. Instead of playing a unit on your second turn, though, you could just choose to answer the opponent's threats. And in that case, you might want to pick Fireball or Firebug. Firebug is a better answer to armored units and keeps your element base a little more flexible because it is a little cheaper. Fireball does more damage overall. It's just answered by armor. So against non-earth decks, Fireball is probably a safer bet to immediately take out whatever your opponent is doing, but it will use both of your elements, so it keeps your element base a little less flexible than Fireball. But these are both options if you just want to clear the board of whatever your opponent is doing and get to turn 3 where we can get to the mid game where this deck really shines. If you want to be a little more risky and play for the mid game, you can instead pick up a Master Medic. So the reason you would opt for a Master Medic instead of another like unit core unit that occupies the 3 element slot or 4 element slot is because support units are a lot more rare in this deck. This deck is mostly unit core. So if you're picking something up to make sure you have a strong mid game, you may want to pick the rare support unit rather than picking a unit core unit because you're more likely to draw more unit core than you are to get this support unit. So taking the support ensures you're going to have strong mid-game support, and you will probably draw into other unit core units that you can then use to basically play frontline to this Master Medic. And this is a more risky option, but it's a strong option for the deck if you don't mind maybe bricking sometimes and not having early game plays. The absolute worst case scenario is if you don't have anything to do turns 1 and 2, and then your only 3-drop is the Master Medic. He's not very powerful on his own, so that is the absolute worst case scenario. But because of the makeup of the deck, it is super duper rare that would actually happen. So even though this is the quote unquote riskier option, I don't find it that risky, and I think it is pretty powerful. And last but not least, I think I'm going to recommend this for most of the decks, but sometimes you just want to play with the heroes. You know, they're the namesake of the deck, they're very powerful cards, you want to make sure you have them in your hand. I totally get that, they're fun to play with. The only downside I would say for this is they usually have very stringent element costs or just very high element costs. So the problem here is if you first pick your Effie, you're kind of locking yourself into playing only fire in the early game if you want to play her on turn 3, which is totally not required. You could play her later, but the later you play your first pick, the more you've had just a dead card in your hand for the whole beginning of the game. And that is even more apparent with Mira, who costs 6 elements. She's a very powerful card, and picking her up early ensures that you're going to have her on turn 6 or whenever you can get her out to make a huge impact in the game. But at the same time, you have to get there knowing that you're going to have a card you literally cannot use for the first 5 turns of the game. So you just have to be able to survive a card down. But again, you will have these fun hero cards to play with once they can eventually be summoned. And those are my recommendations for first pick with this deck. Of course, you can go with whatever you want. These are just some standbys I've used in the past that I think are pretty good. Lastly, I wanted to try and show some strong positions with the deck on the actual board. It's a little tough to show just generically strong positions in this game just because so much of what it is has to do with what your opponent is doing, but I'm going to do my best to kind of show a very, very strong board position. So if you are playing to the center of the board and you are advanced past kind of the halfway mark, this is a very strong position to be in. And this represents your second turn play, third turn play, fourth turn play, and fifth turn play all surviving. So this is not necessarily likely to happen, but it is possible. And if you had this board position, this is incredibly strong. So the nice thing about this is in this position, your Master Medic can protect both of your more vulnerable units, your Pyrowolf Hunter and your Frenzied Salamander, and you just have this very threatening and imposing front line with your Pyrowolf Alpha. This has enough power to take out an enemy player in one hit with 3 fire elements, so if this advances 1 tile, it can threaten instant death. This is also a big threat if they play something to try and deal with the Pyrowolf Alpha. Let's say they knock it out, then you have this revenge killer potentially here. Not to mention you could be summoning something here to try and revenge kill whatever took this out and just pushing with the Pyrowolf Hunter and dealing direct damage or dealing another attack to whatever took out the Pyrowolf Alpha. So this is just like a really threatening position for your opponent to be in. And if they wait around and you're able to threaten moving forward the Pyrowolf Hunter, you can move up the Master Medic, you can move up the Frenzied Salamander. You've got the Frenzied Salamander here with its strong attack sides on the left. This is another 4 damage to face if they let that go. So it's just a really, really rough position to be in. Again, it's unlikely that your opponent would let you get to this completely unanswered, but if you have something like this, it's really tricky to get out from. And then the next position is just everybody formed up around Mira here. So again, like the last position we discussed, this represents a lot of things going right for you. Basically, to get here, your opponent has to be pretty much not answering any of your threats, and you're able to do all of what you want. But these are the types of position you want to be aiming for when you play this deck. Positioning units around Mira to get the most out of her effects, and making sure that you have strong frontline units in front of your support units. That's basically the gist of the deck and has been the theme running through this entire video. And that's part of what makes this such a good deck for beginners. Not only is it a straightforward just kind of push with strong units and support them effectively to win the game sort of game plan, like that's very easy to understand, but it does require a little bit of learning and teach you a little bit about positioning, because you have these asymmetric units that you want the strong attacks to be facing center if at all possible. You've got kind of 2 classes of units here with your frontline core in front of your support units, which are then going to help patch up all their weaknesses and make them tougher to answer. So all these things make it a good deck for learning, and I highly recommend it to anybody who's learning the game. So that's the Radiant Pack. Summon your core frontline units, push them forward, support them with support units behind them and support spells, blow up anything that gets in your way with removal spells, and just march forward to victory. Thank you so much for watching this video, guys. If you like decks like this that are a straightforward approach, or you're just getting into Elementile, please give this deck a whirl. I think you'll have a lot of fun with it, and I look forward to seeing you on the field of Elementile.